The most important thing to understand in any relationship is what goes on inside the head, especially one's own head. If the actors in a relationship cannot observe and assess their own feelings, biases, perceptual distortions, and impulses, they cannot tell whether their actions and interventions are based on perceptions of reality or only on their own needs to express or defend themselves. To understand what goes on inside the head and how this affects our overt behavior, we need a simplifying model of processes that are, in fact, extremely complex. The complexity of intrapsychic processes derives from the fact that our nervous system is simultaneously a data gathering system, a processing system, and a proactive managing system. That is, we observe, we react emotionally to what we have observed, we analyze, process, and make judgments based on observations and feelings, and we behave overtly in order to make something happen. We intervene. In its simplest form, we can lay this out as a sequential circular model. Although real intrapsychic processes do not occur in such a simple, logical sequence, the model permits us to analyze in more detail the complexity of what happens inside the mind, what kinds of traps we fall into, and how this makes our interventions more or less effective. Observation. Observation should be the accurate registering through all of our senses of what is actually occurring in the environment. In fact, the nervous system is proactive, programmed through many prior experiences to filter data that come in. We see and hear more or less what we expect or anticipate based on prior experience, and we block out a great deal of information that is potentially available if it does not fit our expectations, preconceptions, and prejudgments. We do not passively register information. We select out from the available data what we are capable of registering and classifying based on our language and culturally learned concepts, as well as what we want and need. To put it more dramatically, we do not think and talk about what we see what we are able to think and talk about. To learn to observe, then, is to learn about and overcome the traps to which a history of experience and learning has exposed us. The consultant cannot deal with reality if he or she cannot learn to perceive accurately what is going on, and that means getting in touch with one's own history to identify one's own predispositions, stereotypes, and preconceptions. Reaction. The most difficult aspect of learning about our emotional reactions is that we often do not notice them at all. We deny feelings or take them so for granted that we, in effect, short circuit them and move straight into judgments and actions. We may be feeling anxious, angry, guilty, embarrassed, joyful, aggressive, or happy, yet we do not realize we are feeling this way until someone asks us how we are feeling or we take the time to reflect on what is going on inside us. In our culture, we also learn that feelings should not influence judgments, that feelings are a source of distortion, and we are told not to act impulsively on our feelings. But paradoxically, we often end up acting most on our feelings when we are least aware of them, all the while deluding ourselves that we are carefully acting only on judgments, and we are often quite oblivious to the influences that our feelings have on our judgments. Forces we are unaware of cannot be controlled or managed. If we can learn to identify our true feelings and what triggers them, we have a choice of whether or not to give in to those feelings. It is essential for consultants to be able to know what they are feeling, both to avoid bias in responding and to use those feelings as a diagnostic indicator of what may be happening in the client relationship. Judgment. We are constantly processing data, analyzing information, evaluating and making judgments. This ability to analyze prior to action is what makes human capable of planning sophisticated behavior to achieve complex goals and sustain action chains. that takes us years into the future. The capacity to plan ahead and to organize our actions according to plan is one of the most critical aspects of human intelligence. Being able to reason logically is, of course, essential, but all of the analysis and judgments we engage in are worthy only as much as the data on which they are based. So we should at least try to minimize the distortions in the initial information input. The most important implication for consultants is to recognize from the outset that our capacity to reason is limited and that it is only as good as the data on which it is based. Intervention. Once we made some kind of judgment, we act. The judgment may be no more than the decision to act on emotional impulse, but that is a judgment nevertheless, and it is a dangerous to be unaware of it. In other words, when we act impulsively, when we exhibit what are called knee jerk reactions, it seems like we are short circuiting the rational judgment process. In fact, what we are doing is not short circuiting, but giving too much credence to an initial observation and our emotional response to it. Knee jerk reactions that get us into trouble are interventions that are judgments based on incorrect data. As a consultant, I have to remind myself repeatedly that everything I say or do is an intervention with consequences. Let us examine a typical example that frequently occurs in group meetings. I find myself at a group meeting with one member, Steve, who has consistently undermined me or disagreed with me in past meetings. I make a particular point, and it is followed immediately by Steve saying some words pertaining to my point. The cycle now may unfold as follows. Observation. Steve is attacking me by disagreeing with my point. What I may be unaware of is that I am perceiving what Steve said as disagreement because I expected it. And I am seeing disagreement as attack because I also expected to be attacked. Reaction. I am anxious and consequently angry at always being disagreed with and attacked. I feel like really fighting back to make my position very clear. What I may be unaware of is that my emotional reaction is now based on the motives I attributed to Steve, not on what Steve's motives may actually have been. What I may also be unaware of is that my anxiety reaction to the perception of being attacked is valid, but that there are other possible ways of dealing with the anxiety besides getting angry and counterattacking. I may not be aware that, in essence, the anger is a feeling that I have chosen. It is not automatic. Judgment. I make the judgment that Steve must be competing with me for status in this group, and I cannot let him get away with putting me down. I have to assert myself to protect my position. What I am probably unaware of at this point is how this entire seemingly logical conclusion is premised on my initial interpretation of what I thought I saw and my particular emotional response. If I now act on this judgment, I may or may not be acting appropriately because I do not in fact know whether or not my initial observation was correct. Intervention. I vigorously put down Steve's point, leaving him puzzled and having to deal with his own ORJI cycle. If his response is in turn unpredictable, I will not be able to figure out what happened because I am unaware of how my own preconception has led to an intervention that may have nothing to do with Steve's intentions.
To help us understand the ORJI process, let me share to you another poignant example that Shane cited. This example features Dave, an executive who was preparing for an exam to be taken the next morning. To focus on his review, he isolated himself in a room at home and asked his child not to disturb him. But half an hour later, the child appeared at the door, thereby interrupting what Dave was doing. Dave immediately got angry because he asked not to be disturbed, and he observed the child's entry as doing something she was not supposed to. So let us start to illustrate the ORJI cycle at this point. Observing the child's entry, Dave's reaction, he immediately got angry. At this juncture, his judgment was that anger was appropriate, and punished the child as an intervention by yelling that he was not to be disturbed. At this point, you will notice we have completed an origin cycle. But later on, Dave noticed that the child was upset, aloof, and quite distant than before. This observation triggered a new feeling of tension and worry about the child, leading to the judgment that he should find out what was going on. As an intervention, Dave decided to ask his wife some questions. Now, we can see at this stage that we have completed the second ORJI cycle. But the story didn't end here. Dave learned that the child had come down at his wife's request to ask him if he wanted to have a cup of coffee and to say goodnight. Note that this is a new observation. Listening to this explanation, Dave's new reaction is that he felt guilty and ashamed for blowing up. He then made the judgment that he was wrong to quickly get angry before, and so he decided as an intervention to apologize and make up with his child. We will realize at this juncture that this is now the third ORJI cycle flowing from the same event. In this example, we can see Dave has the opportunity to make up for his earlier error, and as he became aware of how he misperceived the situation and how this has led to an inappropriate intervention, he could train himself to check on what he was observing before allowing himself to respond emotionally in future situations. In real life, note that often we do not have second chances as Dave had. Therefore, the key takeaway here is for us to develop our ability to see and reflect on what we are seeing before we make judgments and leap into action. To help us achieve a desirable outcome, Schein identified some traps that, if not avoided, can lead to inappropriate reaction, judgment, or intervention. Trap 1 is misperception. Due to prejudgments, expectations, defenses, or false attributions, we do not accurately perceive what happened or why. In Dave's example, he immediately prejudged his child entering the room with the intent to disturb him, which he later discovered he was wrong. We can avoid this trap by identifying at least three distinguishable bases of misperception, which includes taken for granted cultural assumptions, personal defensive filters or biases, and situational expectations based on past experiences. Trap 2 refers to inappropriate emotional response. Here, prejudgment can lead to an inappropriate emotional response like when Dave immediately got angry seeing his child at the door. To avoid this trap, we need to identify our own emotional response biases. Then trap 3 is making an analysis and judgments based on incorrect data or faulty logic. If Dave had only made an effort to figure out why his child entered the room, then he would know there was no reason for him to get angry. And trap 4 is intervening on seemingly correct judgments that are in fact incorrect. If we allow ourselves to intervene without rechecking and reflecting on the whole cycle, we may act rationally but make the situation worse. Note that trap 3 and 4 could be avoided by instituting systematic checking procedures, one of which is explicit questioning. Through questioning, we can test whether our observations, reactions, and reasoning are correct or not. Or we can adopt silence as an intervention. Remaining silent and just continue to observe may reveal what really is going on. If Dave opted to remain silent, he likely would have avoided the conflict with his child. Finally, the best overall protection to avoid traps is maintaining a spirit of inquiry, a desire to decipher what is really going on, a commitment to listening and helping, instead of actively displaying one's own impulses and feelings before knowing whether or not they are appropriate. The resulting diagram, as we are seeing, integrating the traps, is actually what Schein called the more realistic ORJI model. At this point of our video, we want to share the key points that Shane highlighted in concluding his article. To start with, if we want to be helpful, we must intervene in situations. This can happen in our homes, our work, or in our community. But note that helpful interventions must be based on accurate observations, appropriate emotional responses, and a reasoning process that mirrors how our clients or other stakeholders reason. All this requires some self-insight, which is acquired by maintaining a genuine spirit of inquiry towards oneself and others. And self-insight does not come automatically. It requires a conceptual tool such as the ORJI model. As to the importance of the ORJI model to action research, we would like to refer back to what Copeland posited above. Action research engages action researchers in interiority. That is, that they are able to recognize and hold different forms of knowing while attending to their own subjectivity in how they interpret, choose values, make judgments, and take action. From this premise, we can see how relevant and important the ORJI model is in action research.
Intrapsychic Processes, ORJI, is written by Edgar Henry Schein. Schein was born on March 5, 1928, and he was a former professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He has made a notable mark on the field of organizational development in many areas, including career development, group process consultation, and organizational culture. Schein is primarily known in developing the ORJI cycle. Schein gave a framework for understanding a person's internal thought processes, which he refers to as intrapsychic process. The framework provides a basis for guiding reflection, and he called it the ORJI model. This model is used as a framework for journal keeping and is a significant mechanism for developing first-person skills in action research.